Karibu tusome na taasisi ya elimu Tanzania.
How are you, Form 4 student? Today's lesson is about nationalism in Africa. I hope everyone knows what nationalism is. The term nationalism refers to the feeling of national consciousness or awareness by the people that they are members of a nation and desire freedom from colonial rule. The origin of nationalism in Africa is traced back to the era of colonialism and primary African resistance against colonial rule. The increase of exploitation, such as land alienation, forced to work on plantation by being paid low wages, taxes, long working hours compelled Africans resulted to nationalistic struggle. Its origin and basis were of two perspectives. These are based on reflection of ancient and modern based on recent phenomena characterized by structural conditions of modern society. African nationalism was a desire of African people to rule themselves without being governed by the foreign people or Western countries. During that time, most of Africans wanted to be free from European domination of the African continent. By the mid of 19th, it was an action in which Africans struggled to dismantle colonial rule and gain self-independence. Nationalism in Africa is divided into two phases according to the period, and that is nationalism before 1945 and nationalism after 1945, which sometimes we call it mass nationalism. Of course, there were some general reasons for the rise of nationalism in Africa, and factors that gave birth to African nationalism are of two kinds, which are internal factors and external factors. Starting with internal factors. First of all, these were forces that were internally motivated, that generated within African societies that brought about nationalism in Africa. These included the following factors. Number one, intensive exploitation after the Second World War. In the colonies, the colonizers wanted to revamp their ruined economies, which were heavily damaged by the war. Large-scale colonization was carried out. Number two, formation of independent churches. These were churches that were led by the Africans, breaking away from mainstream white churches to challenge their misdeeds over the Africans. Number three, they addressed not only religions but also social, political, and economic grievances of Africans. Such churches included Joseph Ejai in West Africa, the Kikuyu Native Church, the Watchtower Church movement in Malawi in 1906, the African National Church in Tanganyika, the People, God and Religion of Jesus in Kenya, and United Native Church in Cameroon. Such churches openly criticized the colonialists and encouraged their followers to fight them, thus the rise of African nationalism. Number four, formation of segregated African schools. After realizing that the missionary and colonial school taught nothing but European-based syllabus, some African societies began their own schools. Like among the Kikuyu in Kenya, Africans were taught African syllabus. This helped in educating Africans and developing the spirit of nationalism. Number five, rise of elites who had attained colonial education, like Nyerere in Tanganyika, Nkrumah in Ghana, Kamuzubanda in Malawi, and Abafemi Obolowo of Nigeria. This education helped them to get used to the white language, to get exposed to various struggle and liberation of the world. But on top of that, some elite came from outside Africa. The combination of both helped to the rise of nationalism, provision of leadership for nationalistic struggle. This elite was Black American or Afro-American, such as William Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, and Malcolm X, through conferences held in different places, opened the mind of Africans about setting the free from colonial rule. Number 6. Ghana independence in 1957. It was example to estimate other African nations to begin fight for their freedom, so it as possible for them also to attain independence from their colonial power. Number 7. The Italy against Ethiopia War of 1935 to 1941 under Mussolini, Haile Selassie, and Ras Imra increased the momentum of African nationalism. Italy, an industrialized nation, was heavily and bravely resisted by an African nation, Ethiopia. This boosted African confidence toward their struggle for independence. Number 8. Formation of Social Welfare Association. This aimed to improve the working condition of African workers. Discriminations and colonial abuses to the Africans, such association largely based in urban centers and comprised colonial civil servants like the Kikuyu Central Association in Kenya that was formed by Hari Tuku. Before I go more further, let me welcome my fellow teacher to continue.
Thank you so much. Number 9. Also, the Railway Territory Civil Association in Tanganyika. Tanganyika Territory Civil Service Association, TTCSA, which was formed by Martin Kayamba and the People's Union in 1908 in Nigeria. Such association extended more pressure on colonialists to consider giving African independence, which led to African nationalism. Number 10. Colonial social infrastructures also played a big role in facilitating the spread of a rise of African nationalism. That's why some historians do say that colonialism sown a seed of its own destruction. Infrastructures like railways and roads facilitated nationalistic activities in rural and urban centers by spreading the message of liberation in all parts of Africa. Number 11. Formation of Pan-Africanist movements. In 1900 by William Sylvester from the New World, which later led to the formation of OAU, an organization that united all African independent nations to help in fighting for African independence. Student, apart from the internal factors, also there were external factors, as I said. So now, let us discuss the external factors. The external factors, these were factors that motivated nationalism but being generated from outside Africa. Such forces includes 1. The returning of ex-soldiers who participated in the war on the side of their colonial masters, assisting them as porters and security guards of many camps. This participation brought the awareness since these soldiers were exposed to Western democracy, freedom and liberation, messaged some veterinaries like Dedan Kimathi, who were later a leader of Mau Mau in Kenya. 2. Formation of UNO, which replaced the League of Nations, where independent African states were allowed to participate as members. It becomes an organization of all nations. African and Asian nations, through the UN, opposed the colonialists and demanded self-determination. Unlike during the League of Nations, where African colonies become mandatory colonies of European nations. The Indian and Pakistan independences. These acted as external pressure for the Africans to emulate. Both were British colonies that attained their independence in 1948 as one nation, which later separated into two nations. Following that, African quoted such incidents as a negotiate tool to argue for the independence. Number 4. The Baton Conference of 17th April 1955, where Asians and African nations such as South Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, Libya and Egypt met in Indonesia to discuss their problems, which includes colonialism and economic development. They emphasized in solidarity. It was during this conference that Non-Aligned Movement, NAM, was formed. Number 5. Marshall Plan. This was initiated by George Marshall, the Prime Minister of USA, whereby he began giving loans to the war-ruined European nations on a condition that they should decolonize Africa and Asian nations by granting independence to those nations. Open door policy of USA. This policy was introduced by USA for the aim of conducting businesses with independent African states. Thus, it began requesting colonialists to give independence to African countries so as to do business with USA. Number 7. The British Labour Party, which assumed power in 1945. Its policies were against colonialism, which they viewed as oppression of humanity and wastage of British taxpayers' money, such as anti-colonial sentiments in Britain, made many nationalistic movements to agitate for their immediate independence. Number 8. The rise of the USA as a leading capitalist nation. After the World War II, US became the chief supplier of war materials, and the war did not affect her economy negatively, made her to become a leading capitalist nation, and began to advocate for the colonization of African nations as a trick to compensate for not colonizing through establishment of neo-colonialism to get market for her finished goods, area of investment for her international cooperation. Number 9. The aftermath of the Second World War. To the colonialists who incurred a lot of losses and could not continue with spending to the colonies, so they were forced to grant some independence to some African states. But on top of the above, some European powers adopted intensive exploitation to revamp their economies, which awakened many Africans to resist, thus their rise of nationalism in Africa.
Once upon a time, in Tupendane village, the societies lived in communal mode of production, whereby they shared all major means of production such as land. They cultivated and harvested together. They had their own lifestyles, own customs, norms of conduct, beliefs, culture, and even tradition. They had their own leadership system, forms of education, where basically their education based much in practical performances, and their form of education were known as informal education, in which the young boys were taught with their elders on how to hunt and even protecting their families. They lived very happy, and they used to live as one. Sometimes they were dancing and singing together in different social, ritual, political, and even economic activities. Suddenly, after the invasion of colonies, everything changed. Socially, economically, politically, academically, and in all aspects of life. Things became wars. And these colonies were whites. After colonies' penetration in African continent, they started controlling and exploiting Africans socially, politically, and economically. Also, they forced Africans not to follow their beliefs, and they introduced a formal education system, which was a very segregated form of education. These foreigners changed African lives, make it harder to the extent there was no more happiness since they were forced in cheap labor. The whites took their land by force, made them to be slaves, and they tortured and killed those who were not obeying their orders. Africans get tired of that act against colonies, and hence they started their movement to fight against colonialism. They formed their own union that might help the rest of African to open their minds and fight against colonies. The struggle for self-determination and resistance against the intruders began in Africa immediately after the inception of colonialism around 1890s. Around 1945, nationalism used to spread the African culture and fight out foreign culture that had been promoted by the colonialism, like language, dressing, and table manners, among others. The Africans started to resist colonial domination in the early time. Example, Abu Shil and Bwana Heri in Tanganyika, Shona and Ndebele in Zimbabwe, as well as Nama and Herero in Namibia. Acts like land alienation, forced labor, injustice and taxation now were affecting the Africans more. And this is how it sounded.
Africa is for Africa.
Yes, of course.
For sure.
It is enough. It is enough. In fact, it is enough.
We can't tolerate this.
No.
We have to speak out. We have to.
No, it is enough. No, please.
My leader! Huh? These boys took our lands. Huh? Pay us low wages. They are forcing us to pay matiti tax. Huh? Forcing our husbands, our fathers to cheap labor and slavery. We are tired of being beaten in our own land. This is our land.
No!
Free our land! Free our land! Free our land! Free our people! Africa, eh! Africa, oh, mama, eh! Africa, eh! Africa, oh, mama, oh! Africa, eh! Africa, mama, oh! Africa, eh! Africa, mama, eh! Africa, eh!
I remember how life was beautiful in our mama land. White kicked us away and forced us to pay tax in our own land. My reader, they are raping our wives and sisters. They are forcing us to use money for exchange and destroy the all bright future. We can't tolerate this.
My people, this is our land, our mama land. This is heritage from our ancestors. We must protect our people. No one, therefore, should rise up to assume absolutely power over the rest. This means the flow of respect in the society. We are one. Africa is one. As one we can defeat whites.
As one we can defeat whites!
As one we can defeat whites!
As one we can defeat whites!
Class, after this short story, now let us discuss the meaning and the importance of nationalism. First of all, nationalism brings the sense of unity amongst African ethnic groups. For example, through the formation of political movements to free for the formation of modern African nations under single government. Also dismantled all the evils of European capitalism that drawing the early year of independence. Not only that, but also it brings political awareness to most of African people against economic exploitation done by the Europeans. Nationalism rejected capitalist occupation, and finally Africans achieved independence and self-rule. It was a pro-African culture. This means that all political movements brought Africans to be able to govern them under African leadership. Nationalism used the spread of African culture to fight out foreign culture that had been promoted by colonialism, like language, dressing, and table manners, among others. And also used to remove inferior complex among the Africans and to appreciate the effort of liberating themselves from the European domination. Student, are we together? Good. Now, let us proceed to discuss about nationalism in Africa before 1945. In the first decade of colonial rule, most of East African communities experienced only spasmodic contact with the white man. But by the mid of 1920s, the activities of government officials, missionaries and settlers were beginning to impinge or to affect much more direct on the lives of many Africans. Acts like land alienation, forced labor, injustice and taxation now were affecting the Africans more. The struggle for self-determination and resistance against the intruders began in Africa immediately after the inception of colonialism around 1890s. The Africans started to resist colonial domination in early time. For example, Abushiri and Wanaheri in Tanganyika, Shona and Ndebele in Zimbabwe, as well as Nama and Herero in Namibia. The African resistance was of three kinds. 1. Passive resistance, 2. Collaborative resistance, and 3. Active resistance. However, the period and intensity in which the early African resistance occurred in various societies depended on the intensity of colonial activities and its impact. For example, as early as 1890s, the people of Ghana had already formed the Gold Coast Aboriginal Right Protection Society, which was to fight against the laws which had been enacted to exploit African land. Also, in 1920, the biggest welfare association in the region was the National Congress of British West Africa in Accra. It was largely formed by the emerging African elites who wanted increased and effective representation in various organs of the state, especially in the legislature. And there was causes of nationalism in Africa before 1945. First of all, were the political grievances. Also, they lost their independence to foreigners, thus nationalism to regain their lost independence. African rulers were thrown away and replaced them by foreign rulers who were imposed on the African that they detected and wanted to restate their traditional rulers. Not only that, but also economic grievances. They forced labor to work on the colonial plantations to provide cheap labor, and any African who resisted were punished heavily. Also, imposition of heavy taxes as to initiate money economy taxes like hard tax, poll tax, matiti tax were introduced as to force the indigenous to work in the plantation cattle, confiscation as to deny Africans from engaging in other economic activities, and result on supplying cheap labor. Moreover, land alienation to keep Africans away from practicing their subsistence agriculture and began to supply cheap labor in plantation. Also, loss of control of their trade, like long-distance trade and trans-Saharan trade, as well as the introduction of the so-called legitimate trade. Destruction of African agriculture, which was a self-sustaining that based on the needs of Africa and in place cash crop plantation was introduced. Also, social grievances. Colonial injustice and oppression like long working hours, social abuses, and separation of men from their families. Heavy punishment like chopping off limbs of Africans in case of the Congo colony under Belgium, corporal punishment in Tanganyika under Karl Peters. Racism and segregation of Africans by insulting them by their color and making them the third-grade citizens of their own land. Destruction of African values and traditions, implanting foreign cultures like religion, language, education, and culture. Though you have to keep in mind that from 1919 to 1940s, nationalistic struggles changed from wars of resistance to formation of social welfare associations. Student, that's the end of our class today. Thank you.